Section 6 of the History of England, from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England, from the Accession of James II, Volume 3, Chapter 15, by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Section 6. There were indeed exceptions, but they were very few, and they were to be found almost exclusively in two classes, which, though widely differing from each other in social position, closely resembled each other in laxity of principle. All the Whigs who are known to have trafficked with St. Germains belonged, not to the main body of the party, but either to the head or to the tail. They were either patricians high in rank and office, or caitiffs who had long been employed in the foulest drudgery of faction. To the former class belonged Shrewsbury. Of the latter class the most remarkable specimen was Robert Fergusson. From the day on which the Convention Parliament was dissolved, Shrewsbury began to waver in his allegiance. But that he had ever wavered was not, till long after, suspected by the public. That Fergusson had, a few months after the Revolution, become a furious Jacobite was no secret to anybody, and ought not to have been matter of surprise to anybody. For his apostasy he could not plead even the miserable excuse that he had been neglected. The ignominious services which he had formerly rendered to his party as a spy, a raiser of riots, a dispenser of bribes, a writer of libels, a prompter of false witnesses, had been rewarded only too prodigally for the honour of the new government. That he should hold any high office was, of course, impossible. But in a sinecure place of 500 a year had been created for him in the department of the excise. He now had what to him was opulence, but opulence did not satisfy him. For money indeed he had never scrupled to be guilty of fraud aggravated by hypocrisy, yet the love of money was not his strongest passion. Long habits had developed in him a moral disease from which people who make political agitation their calling are seldom wholly free. He could not be quiet. Sedition from being his business had become his pleasure. It was as impossible for him to live without doing mischief as for an old dram drinker or an old opium eater to live without the daily dose of poison. The very discomforts and hazards of a lawless life had a strange attraction for him. He could no more be turned into a peaceable and loyal subject than the fox can be turned into a shepherd's dog, or than the kite can be taught the habits of the barn-door fowl. The Red Indian prefers his hunting ground to cultivated fields and stately cities. The gipsy, sheltered by a commodious roof and provided with meat in due season, still pines for the ragged tent on the moor and the meal of carrion, and even so Fergusson became weary of plenty and security of his salary, his house, his table and his coach, longed to be again the president of societies, where none could enter without a password, the director of secret presses, the distributor of inflammatory pamphlets, to see the walls placarded with descriptions of his person and offers of reward for his apprehension, to have 6 or 7 names, with a different wig and cloak for each, and to change his lodgings thrice a week at dead of night. His hostility was not to Popery or to Protestantism, to monarchical government or to republican government, to the House of Stuart or to the House of Nassau, but to whatever was at the time established. By the Jacobites this new ally was eagerly welcomed. They were at the moment busied with schemes in which the help of a veteran plotter was much needed. There had been a great stir among them from the day on which it had been announced that William had determined to take the command in Ireland, and they were all looking forward with impatient hope to his departure. He was not a prince against whom men lightly ventured to set up a standard of rebellion. His courage, his sagacity, the secrecy of his counsels, the success which had generally crowned his enterprises, overawed the vulgar. Even his most acrimonious enemies feared him at least as much as they hated him. While he was at Kensington, ready to take horse at a moment's notice, malcontents who prized their heads and their estates were generally content to vent their hatred by drinking confusion to his hooked nose, and by squeezing with significant energy the orange which was his emblem. But their courage rose when they reflected that the sea would soon roll between him and our island. In the military and political calculations of that age, 30 leagues of water were as important as 300 leagues now are. The winds and waves frequently interrupted all communication between England and Ireland. It sometimes happened that, during a fortnight or 3 weeks, not a word of intelligence from London reached Dublin. 20 English counties might be up in arms long before any rumour than an insurrection was even apprehended could reach Ulster. Early in the spring, therefore, the leading malcontents assembled in London for the purpose of concerting an extensive plan of action, and corresponded assiduously both with France and with Ireland. Such was the temper of the English factions when, on the 20th of March, the new Parliament met. The first duty which the Commons had to perform was that of choosing a Speaker. Trevor was proposed by Lowther, was elected without opposition, and was presented and approved with the ordinary ceremonial. The King then made a speech in which he especially recommended to the consideration of the House 2 important subjects, the settling of the revenue and the granting of an amnesty. He represented strongly the necessity of despatch. Every day was precious. The season for action was approaching. Let not us, he said, be engaged in debates while our enemies are in the field. The first subject which the Commons took into consideration was the state of revenue. A great part of the taxes had, since the accession of William and Mary, been collected under the authority of Acts passed for short terms, and it was now time to determine on a permanent arrangement. A list of the salaries and pensions for which provision was to be made was laid before the House, and the amount of the sums thus expended called forth very just complaints from the independent members, among whom Sir Charles Sedley distinguished himself by his sarcastic pleasantry. A clever speech which he made against the placemen stole into print and was widely circulated. It has since been often republished, and it proves, what his poems and plays might make us doubt, that his contemporaries were not mistaken in considering him as a man of parts and vivacity. Unfortunately, the ill humour which the sight of the civil list caused evaporated in jests and invectives without producing any reform. The ordinary revenue by which the government had been supported before the Revolution had been partly hereditary, and had been partly drawn from taxes granted to each sovereign for life. The hereditary revenue had passed, with the Crown, to William and Mary. It was derived from the rents of the royal domains, from fees, from fines, from wine licenses, from the first fruits and tenths of benefices, from the receipts of the post office, and from that part of the excise which had, immediately after the Restoration, been granted to Charles II to his successors, for ever in lieu of the feudal services due to our ancient kings. The income from these sources were estimated at between 400,000 and 500,000 pounds. Those duties of excise and customs which had been granted to James for life had, at the close of his reign, yielded about 900,000 pounds annually. William naturally wished to have this income on the same terms on which his uncle had enjoyed it, and his ministers did their best to gratify his wishes. Lowther moved that the grant should be to the King and Queen for their joint and separate lives, and spoke repeatedly and earnestly in defence of this motion. He set forth William's claims to public gratitude and confidence, the nation rescued from popery and arbitrary power, the Church delivered from persecution, the Constitution established on a firm basis. Would the common deals grudgingly with a prince who had done more for England than had ever been done for her by any of his predecessors in so short a time, with a prince who was now about to expose himself to hostile weapons and pestilential air in order to preserve the English colony in Ireland, with a prince who was prayed for in every corner of the world where a congregation of Protestants could meet for the worship of God. But on this subject Lowther harangued in vain. Whigs and Tories were equally fixed in the opinion that the liberality of Parliaments had been the chief cause of the disasters of the last 30 years, that to the liberality of the Parliament of 1660 was to be ascribed to the misgovernment of the Cabal, and to the liberality of the Parliament of 1685 was to be ascribed the Declaration of Indulgence, and that the Parliament of 1690 would be inexcusable if it did not profit by a long, a painful, and unvarying experience. After much dispute, a compromise was made. That portion of the excise which had been settled for life on James, and which was estimated at 300,000 pounds a year, was settled on William and Mary for their joint and separate lives. It was supposed that, with the hereditary revenue, and with 300,000 a year more from the excise, their Majesties would have, independent of parliamentary control, between 700,000 and 800,000 a year. Out of this income was to be defrayed the charge both of the royal household and of those civil offices of which a list had been laid before the House. This income was therefore called the civil list. The expenses of the royal household are now entirely separated from the expenses of the civil government, but by a whimsical perversion the name of civil list has remained attached to that portion of the revenue which is appropriated to the expenses of the royal household. It is still more strange that several neighbouring nations should have thought this most unmeaning of all names worth borrowing. Those duties of customs which had been settled for life on Charles and James successively, and which, in the year before the Revolution, had yielded £600,000, were granted to the Crown for a term of only 4 years. William was by no means well pleased with this arrangement. He thought it unjust and ungrateful in a people whose liberties he had saved to bind him over to his good behaviour. The gentlemen of England, he said to Burnet, trusted King James, who was an enemy of their religion and of their laws, and they will not trust me by whom their religion and their laws have been preserved. Burnet answered very properly that there was no mark of personal confidence which his Majesty was not entitled to demand, but that this question was not a question of personal confidence. The Estates of the realm wished to establish a general principle. They wished to set a precedent which might secure a remote posterity against evils such as the indiscreet liberality of former parliaments had produced. From those evils your Majesty has delivered this generation, by accepting the gift of the Commons on the terms of which it is offered. Your Majesty will be also deliverer of future generations. William was not convinced, but he had too much wisdom and self-command to give way to his ill humour, and he accepted graciously what he could not but consider as ungraciously given. The civil list was charged with an annuity of £20,000 to the Princess of Denmark, in addition to an annuity of £30,000, which had been settled on her at the time of her marriage. This arrangement was the result of a compromise which had been effected with much difficulty, and after many irritating disputes. The King and Queen had never, since the commencement of their reign, been on very good terms with their sister. That William should have been disliked by a woman who had just sense enough to perceive that his temper was sour and his manners repulsive, and who was utterly incapable of appreciating his higher qualities, is not extraordinary. But Mary was made to be loved. So lively and intelligent a woman could not indeed derive much pleasure from the society of Anne, who, when in good humour, was meekly stupid, and, when in bad humour, was sulkily stupid. Yet the Queen, whose kindness had endeared her to her humblest attendants, would hardly have made an enemy of one whom it was her duty and her interest to make a friend, had not an influence strangely potent and strangely malignant been incessantly at work to divide the royal house against itself. The fondness of the Princess for Lady Marlborough was such as, in a superstitious age, which had been ascribed to some talisman or potion. Not only had the friends in their confidential intercourse with each other dropped all ceremony and all titles, and become plain Mrs. Morley and plain Mrs. Freeman, but even Prince George, who cared as much for the dignity of his birth, and he was capable of caring for anything but claret and Calvert salmon, submitted to be Mr. Morley. The Countess boasted that she had selected the name of Freeman because it was peculiarly suited to the frankness and boldness of her character, and, to do her justice, it was not by the ordinary arts of courtiers that she established and long maintained her despotic empire over the feeblest of minds. She had little of that tact which is the characteristic talent of her sex. She was far too violent to flatter or to dissemble, but by a rare chance she had fallen in with a nature on which dictation and contradiction acted as philtres. In this grotesque friendship all the loyalty, the patience, the self-devotion was on the side of the mistress. The whims, the haughty airs, the fits of ill temper, were on the side of the waiting woman. Nothing is more curious than the relation in which the two ladies stood to Mr. Freeman, as they called Marlborough. In foreign countries people knew in general that Anne was governed by the Churchills. They knew also that the man who appeared to enjoy so large a share of her favour was not only a great soldier and politician, but also one of the finest gentlemen of his time, that his face and figure were eminently handsome, his temper at once bland and resolute, his manners at once engaging and noble. Nothing could be more natural than that graces and accomplishments like his should win a female heart. On the Continent, therefore, many persons imagined that he was Anne's favoured lover, and he was so described in contemporary French libels, which have long been forgotten. In England this calumny never found credit even with the vulgar, and is nowhere to be found even in the most ribald doggerel that was sung about our streets. In truth, the princess seems never to have been guilty of a thought inconsistent with her conjugal vows. To her Marlborough, with all his genius and his valour, his beauty and his grace, was nothing but the husband of her friend. Direct power over her Royal Highness he had none. He could influence her only by the instrumentality of his wife, and his wife was no passive instrument. Though it is impossible to discover in anything that she ever did, said, or wrote, any indication of superior understanding, her fierce passions and strong will enabled her often to rule a husband who was born to rule grave senates and mighty armies. His courage, that courage which the most perilous emergencies of war only made cooler and more steady, failed him when he had to encounter his Sarah's ready tears and voluble reproaches, the poutings of her lip and the tossings of her head. History exhibits to us few spectacles more remarkable than that of a great and wise man, who, when he had combined vast and profound schemes of policy, could carry them into effect only by inducing one foolish woman, who was often unmanageable, to manage another woman who was more foolish still. In one point the Earl and the Countess were perfectly agreed. They were equally bent on getting money, though when it was got he loved to hoard it, and she was not unwilling to spend it. The favour of the Princess they both regarded as a valuable estate. In her father's reign they had begun to grow rich by means of her bounty. She was naturally inclined to parsimony, and, even when she was on the throne, her equipages and tables were by no means sumptuous. It might have been thought, therefore, that, while she was a subject, 30,000 a year, with a resident in the palace, would have been more than sufficient for all her wants. There were probably not in the kingdom two noblemen possessed of such an income, but no income would satisfy the greediness of those who governed her. She repeatedly contracted debts, which James repeatedly discharged, not without expressing much surprise and displeasure. Section 6.